Hey gang, it's Will again, and I'm here to regale you with more nonsense from my adventures in scale modeling. What I'm going to do this time is for you guys that watched my last video about building the Hasegawa 1/32 scale P51D, is do a kind of a post-mortem of that, kind of a what did I learn video. Not, and let me make it clear, not in any way to be instructive, not in the how-to or tutorial sense anyway, because that would be ridiculous. I'm just nowhere near at a point where I should be telling anybody how to do anything. But I wanted to kind of do a post-mortem, partly to just encapsulate all of the lessons that I learned in my own head, but also what I'm hoping is that some of you guys that are more experienced and have more knowledge will chime in and go, oh yeah, well here's what you do next time to keep yourself out of trouble. So hopefully this will be useful for me and for anybody else that watches it, and it'll be a good way to kind of capture a bunch of things that I'm sure all of you guys have already learned. Okay, I think I've got this set up in a way that'll work. I don't have the fancy camera setup that a lot of you guys do, so I'm just using my Gorilla Pod and making sure I've got the thing in the frame. Okay, so what did I learn? Let's start with the big ticket item. The Hasegawa 1/32 scale Mustang is a terrible kit. But we've already talked about that. No reason to belabor that any further. Part of the reason that it is a terrible kit, however, is because nothing fits. And, some of that's down to my own clumsiness, but I did have to do a lot of filling and sanding when I put the fuselage and the wings together. And I started out originally with Squadron White Putty because that's just what I had. It was starting to dry up because I had it so long, and so after I'd used a little bit of that, this past summer I bought some Squadron Green Putty. Actually, I bought the Tamiya White Putty first, and I really liked it. It was real easy to work with, a little bit thinner than the Squadron White or the Squadron Green, and I liked that. But I noticed that it didn't sand quite as well as I'd hoped. It seems like it gets kind of hard and it doesn't feather out on the edges when you're sanding it down. In an area like this, that's really important. I also found out that later on when I went back to rescribe panel lines like across here, that the stuff seemed to be kind of brittle. And it got real scratchy when I was trying to cut those grooves through it, and it chipped some and just didn't really behave well. I decided to go ahead and get some Squadron Green because I was familiar with that from when I was a kid, and that stuff just always works. It's been around forever, and it definitely sands out and feathers really nice, and that was important in areas like this where these gun doors stood up too proud and I had to sand them down and kind of blend everything in. And then when I went to rescribe those panel lines, I didn't have the same kind of issues that I did with the Squadron White. With the Tamiya White. I also got myself, on Paul's recommendation, some Perfect Plastic Putty, and that's a water-based material, as you guys know, and that really worked great. It's so easy to work with that in areas like this panel line right here that was way too deep for scale, that it was real easy to put the Perfect Plastic Putty in there and then do the damp Q-tip trick to just wipe away everything, and it just stays in that gap or in that groove, and you don't have to do any sanding. I've learned two things about Perfect Plastic Putty though. One is that in that situation, it may look like it's flush when you're done wiping away the excess, but it's really below the surface on either side of the groove. And you're still going to have a line that shows. Now, that may be fine because, like in this case, I didn't necessarily want that panel line completely gone. I just wanted to minimize it. So that actually worked out pretty good. The other thing is that the stuff seems to dry up in the tube a lot, and I don't really know what to do about that yet. Hopefully I'm not going to end up with a expensive tube of hard putty that I can't use anymore after getting it shipped over from the UK. But it's good stuff. I really like it. So once I got done with all of that, you guys know if you watched my last video, and if for those guys who did, I really appreciate it, that it was time to prime this whole thing. And I learned a couple of things there. One is that decanting primer may or may not work. I still don't know if my issues were about using Propel cans or about the fact that I decanted the tester's enamel primer. I definitely learned with Propel cans that it's just not a good way to go. You can't control the pressure, and it's super expensive. Those cans are about 13 bucks a piece, and one can will give you enough to do an entire plane this size about 1.5 times. So it's just not very economical. The thing about the primer itself, I don't know if there's just something in it that reacted with the gas in the Propel can, or if decanting tester's enamel primer is just never going to work. I don't know. I'm never going to do it again. There's no need to, because I've moved on to other primers like the Vallejo surface primer. I've learned a lot about that stuff as well. One thing is that it just doesn't work very good. Vallejo surface primer, I don't know, it's an acrylic, and it's got all the advantages of that, but a good primer should do about 10 different things, or at least be capable of it. And I'm not going to go through that whole list, but you've got to be able to sand it, it's got to be able to dry quickly, it's got to show you all of your blemishes, it's just got to be easy to work with. I mean, priming should be the least stressful part of any paint job. And the Vallejo stuff, the biggest issue I had with it is that it doesn't sand very well without tearing, and that's even waiting days and days and days for it to dry. And that's even with using a real fine grit paper. I say real fine grit, I mean like 320, like the first thing you might hit it with on your first sanding pass. The stuff tears, and once it starts tearing, it's like impossible to stop it. And if you've got an area that's really smooth like this, and then you've got one little chunk of paint that's torn out, it's a real pain in the ass to try and fix that, because you've got to fill it back in with paint, you've got to sand it down, and the edges of that torn area will show really bad, especially under something like this silver paint. So what I started doing was I mixed it about anywhere from 25 to 50% with Future, and that actually made it a usable primer. For whatever reason, that makes it sandable. It's still not great, but at least it's usable, and I'm not going to waste that bottle of primer. So once I moved on to actually getting to paint this thing, everything went pretty well. I did my first ever try at masking with blue tack. Some people have said that it leaves residue, and I didn't have that problem. Maybe it's a question of how long you leave it sitting on the surface, but I didn't have any issues with it. I thought it worked great. The one thing that I learned is, as you can see if you were really able to look close, some areas like this, you've got to be consistent in how well you mash it down onto the surface that you're masking, because that's going to have an effect on the spray pattern. And there's some inconsistencies in mine where I have some really sharp lines, like right here, and then I have what I think are nice sort of scale feathered boundaries like this, that look like they might have, if this was done with a spray gun. And I guess that's always just sort of, up to each person's interpretation, because I think in some cases this stuff was sprayed on in real life out in the field, but I also think there were situations where, guys were just doing whatever they could with whatever they had at hand, and they might have been swabbing this, crappy paint on with a 4-inch paintbrush or a broom. I mean, who knows? It was wartime, so I really don't think that there's a correct answer. It's whatever works for you. Once I got through with all the paint and I got on to weathering, I also learned some things. I learned that that glossy surface that you put down with Future to hold your decals does not work well with pastel chalks. On the other hand, once you have a satin surface, you can get too much traction for the pastels, and I learned that the hard way. Some of these areas here that some people might look at and think that they're foggy because of the varnish is actually just me putting too much chalk. I was trying to achieve a kind of a faded, weathered look to this olive drab with some white chalk, and the first go round wasn't quite heavy enough, so I did it again, and it was a little too much. But at that point, I couldn't get it off. So even though chalk is a pretty safe way to do it, you can go too far, because I couldn't even get it to come off even with a damp Q-tip. I mean, it was going to be what it was going to be. But again, weathering, there's no right answer. It is what it is. I also learned that doing things like gun stains or powder burns and exhaust stains with my airbrush is much tougher than it looks. I ended up using just flat black Model Master enamel, and that worked pretty good, but it's a gradual process, and I'm hopefully going to get better at it, but I was pretty heavy-handed on this go round. Speaking of Model Master enamels, I did the deal where you make washes and do weathering using enamels on top of acrylic varnish, and that worked really good. Whoever invented that trick is a genius, because that works as advertised. If it's not right, you just scrub it off with a little bit of mineral spirits and go at it again, and I really liked that. I also tried a trick that I learned from watching Inafix's or Making Models Again, watching his videos of using a silver pencil to do chipping. The first thing I learned about that is that it does not work on glossy surfaces. Again, it's got to be able to get some traction. But when the surface has kind of got a satin texture to it, this Prismacolor silver pencil actually kind of did a cool thing. It let me create a sort of a burnished silver look in here, the way that aluminum does when you've got natural metal finish and it gets rubbed on and abraded by things like boot heels or the soles of somebody's shoes. So I really like that effect. Again, it's a learning process of figuring out what tricks work. I forgot to mention that I also did my first whack at using bare metal foil, and that's on the flaps here, and I used it to mask the canopy, and stuff is amazing. I mean, it can be difficult, but it works really good, and you just can't substitute for the look of real aluminum. So I think I'll be doing more of that. I did learn that it's really tough to control the point on a number 2 X-Acto blade and get all your lines perfect around the canopy frame. So next time I'm going to try a more scalpel shaped blade like Paul Budzik recommends, and hopefully that'll work better. But overall, for my first time ever doing it, I feel pretty good about it, and I even like the residue that the foil adhesive left here, because it kind of looks like bug stains. And hey, flying a P-51 in late summer France at treetop level, you're going to have some of those, I think. So at any rate, I did learn a lot with this, and hopefully I'll be able to apply all those things to my next kit, which is the Tamiya 1/48 Spitfire, and over time I will figure out how all this stuff is supposed to work, and I'll get even better results. And like I said, if you guys see things that you know I can do better or do differently, don't hesitate to tell me, because that's what I'm here for, is to learn. All right, guys? Thank you, and thank you for watching. Okay, so of course I went and watched what I just said, and I realized that of course there were some things that I forgot to touch on, so I'm doing an addendum. I hope I can do that. I hope that's allowed. Anyhow, a couple of things with regard to the Canopy. This is the first time that I had ever done the trick where you dip the Canopy in Future or Clear or Pledge or whatever it's called in your country. But that is another miracle trick. It's amazing how much it improves the clarity and the apparent scale thickness of the glass. But I learned a couple of things from that experience. I had seen people say that Future would protect the clear parts from superglue fogging, and when I was putting the windscreen on, I had plenty of room, and because I knew it was the bottom portion of it was going to be covered up with paint, and I wanted to keep moving, so I decided to use superglue. Fortunately, I only put it down at the bottom, but I did have a little bit of fogging, and I don't know if that's got to do with the amount that I used or what, but it proved to me that that having the Future on there is no guarantee that the cyanoacrylate won't cause fogging. The other thing that I learned is when I was putting the rear portion, the bubble canopy on, in all their wisdom, Hasegawa made the clear part and the lower frame separate pieces, and of course they don't fit. So that was a little bit of a wrestling match, and that meant that I was latched onto that bubble canopy with a death grip, and I discovered that the oils or the acids or whatever in my fingertips etched my fingerprints directly into the layer of Future, and it looked horrible. It was on both sides, and so I thought, well, worst case is I just go and scrub it off with some Windex. But I tried an easier trick first. I used one of my Ultimate Modeling Products Thinny Sticks. I think this is the 1200 grit. And I polished out the fingerprint, which basically just removed the Future completely from that area. And then I just dipped it again. Perfect. No issues whatsoever. Totally happy with the result. So that was a good save. The other thing that I didn't remember to talk about earlier was a couple of things that I learned about using bare metal foil. I'm pretty sure I mentioned that I put them on I put bare metal foil on the ailerons. And the first thing is that all of the various coats of varnish, satin varnish on here 2 or 3 times, totally takes away, or almost completely takes away, that realistic aluminum sheen, which, you know, is a real bummer. It's not a game change. No, I mean, it's not a deal breaker, but still, you know, that's kind of the point of using bare metal foil. So I was a little bit bummed about that, and I'll have to try and figure out how to work around that next time I use bare metal foil for that purpose. The other thing that I figured out, which really anybody should know, these acrylic paints don't stick to that foil, which, you know, that's aluminum for you. And so I had to be really careful in places. You know, once I had painted the stripes, or the olive drab, I had to come back and mask for these black stripes, and that meant masking across where I had paint on the aluminum foil. So I had to kind of rig up a little mask using some cardstock that didn't actually adhere to the surface at that point, and it worked out fine. It was a little bit of a hassle, but it was way better than having the paint tear off when I lifted the masking tape off. And of course, that's something that you can also use to your advantage if you want to create some chipping effects, I suppose. But at any rate, those were a couple of other things that I learned that I thought were worth mentioning. I also had one other weird thing. When I was painting the invasion stripes back here, I did the whole block in white, and then I came back and I masked off and painted the black. And my masking was tight. I know that it was. I checked it. But I had some weird kind of... it almost looked like that the black paint had infiltrated the white paint and gone underneath the tape in a couple of places. I don't really know any other way to explain it. It wasn't like a straight up leak where you've got, your masking is loose. And it made me wonder if maybe I just didn't allow enough time because it was like, I don't know, an hour after I had painted the white part that I came back and masked the black part. So maybe I didn't wait long enough. Maybe I was just painting too wet. That's a habit that I'm having to break. I'm used to, traditional painting where you lay down a lot of stuff wet, and that's not a good idea here, I guess. So anyway, maybe it was that. But speaking of waiting long enough, I forgot to say about the Canopy thing and my fingerprints. My fingerprints got etched into that after that thing had been sitting for at least 24 hours. So I know that it wasn't a matter of the future being still soft or anything like that. It just, I guess I've got toxic fingertips or something. But anyway, so okay, I think that's everything. If it's not, chances are I'll make that mistake again, and I'll get to do it on my next What Did I Learn video. All right, guys, thanks for sticking with me. Appreciate it.